Okay, so I'm up next, and I won't introduce myself, since you all know who I am. This is officially titled in the schedule for the event, The Algorithmic Self in Love, but it's actually a paper that I'm writing with a couple of colleagues called The Quantified Relationship. I'm writing with these two guys, Sven Nyholm from Eindhoven, and then Brianer from all over the place, but I think he's currently in Yale, but used to be in the UIRA Centre in Oxford. Right, so I'll break this talk just down into three main sections. I'll try and explain what a quantified relationship is and how I define it and understand it, and introduce you to some of the apps and technologies that are available for facilitating a quantified relationship. That's always fun, people enjoy that part. Then I'll look at 8 objections to the practice of the quantified relationship that have been developed in the literature to date. There's a handful of papers on this topic already, and most of them are written from quite a negative or critical perspective. And one of the tasks in the paper that I'm writing with Brian and Sven is to taxonomize or organize these objections and try to give voice to them or the clearest expression of them. And then we have some responses to those objections, which we use to adopt an attitude of cautious openness or optimism towards this technology. We don't think it's resolutely negative. We think there are ways in which it could be used thoughtfully and appropriately, but we definitely have concerns about some of the ethos or ideology underlying these technologies. Okay, so if I go into the first of those topics, talk about what a quantified relationship is, and defining the quantified relationship, I have a 3-part definition, which is just kind of a standard adaptation of the definition of the quantified self to the context of relationships. So the driving assumption behind this paper is that the kinds of technologies that people use to track their own data and monitor information about themselves, they can also use to track and monitor information in their intimate lives, in the romantic and sexual relationships that they have with other people. So we define a quantified relationship as any relationship with the following 3 features. Intimate tracking, so we mean here the collection of data arising from intimate behaviours, for example, the tracking of sexual or romantic behaviours, and I'll discuss some of the technologies that are out there for doing that in a moment. Intimate gamification, so the use of game-like incentives within the context of an intimate relationship in order to change behaviour. For example, the use of leaderboards, or badges, or awards. And then finally, intimate surveillance, the use of tracking technologies to survey the behavior of your intimate partner or partners, as the case may be. And so we've got 3-part definition: surveillance, gamification, and tracking. As somebody pointed out, I think it's actually Deborah Lupton in her book on the quantified self, she doesn't like the terminology, the quantified self, because not all of the data or information that is tracked by the technologies that I'm about to talk about is quantified or quantifiable. Some of it is just qualitative data. She prefers the term self-tracking, but the term quantified self seems to have taken off, so we're applying that by analogy to the quantified relationship. And so what kinds of technologies are out there, or apps, devices that facilitate these 3 things? Well, you can break those down into 3 main categories. They're basically what I'll call sex tracking apps. So here's an example of one. This is an app called Sex Keeper, which tracks the number of sex acts you perform, their duration, the calories burned during those sex acts. This one is still available. One problem with this field that I've discovered, and it's true across quantified self technologies and mobile health technologies, is that apps just kind of pass in and out of existence on a fairly frequent basis. They just don't, some of them don't get enough traction or user databases, and so they fail and they go under. That's largely because they're still kind of funded with some commercial aim in mind, which is one of the criticisms and problems we have with this technology, that there's not enough of a open source ethos within quantified self movement. So this is Sex Keeper. There was another famous app a few years ago called Spreadsheets, which tracked decibel level during sex, number of thrusts during sex. It was like you left the phone on the bed and it could gauge how many thrusts took place during a sexual encounter. So these are the kinds of examples. And this one here, gives you a nice readout of the amount of time you've spent having sex and calories burned, and so forth. And also the number of poses that you've used as well, so 3. Another example here is nipple. This, sadly, at least I was kind of sad when this happened, it's no longer available. But this had a lot of funding behind it, a very fancy kind of user interface, and you tracked the different kinds of sexual acts you performed every day. You can see the examples here: sex, masturbation, petting, oral sex, kiss. And you rank it or rate it using this smiley face system. And you could also input other information like the positions during sex. And it created a score for you. So you got these nipple points. And if you went onto their website, originally they had a leaderboard. This is gamification, so like the top nipple performers per week. And you could see how you ranked relative to everybody else. These are some smart sex toys. This is lovely. Just started shipping in November 2016. It's a smart sex toy that fits around the base of the penis, and it tracks various information. You can maybe see some of it there. No, I don't think you can. So this is another sex tracking device. Final example, Kegel is a smart Kegel exercise device, which includes a good deal of gamification in it. That's the user interface. Now, I mean, Kegel exercises aren't necessarily linked to sexual behavior, and their primary health purpose is not for that. But this particular device does include within its marketing materials that it's good for intimate well-being. And you can read stories that are quite interesting of journalists trying out the device and seeing how many points and scores they got over a 30-day period. So those are sex tracking devices. There are also then like relationship tracking apps and services. There are quite a number of these. The majority of them effectively are like privatized social media services for couples. They allow them to create their own personal communication forum, to track important events within their relationships, create a shared story or timeline of their relationship. So Couply is one example among many of this, and you can see it. You record important events. The screenshot here is Joey took me out for a stroll in the park, for example. And you also earn points on Couply based on the number of kind of romantic gestures that you perform. And you can compare yourself to other couples or relationships to see who's the best couple. So again, strong element of gamification built into this app. There was another one a few years ago called Canoodle, very similar goal or intention behind it, but it has subsequently failed. There are a lot of fertility tracking apps. I don't necessarily include these within the scope of relationship quantification. I think it's possible to treat child rearing and the focus on pregnancy and fertility is somewhat separate, although some would disagree. But Glow and Glow Nurture, they're definitely like the biggest of these apps and the most successful. A lot of funding behind them, most widely used, and they collect the most information. And a lot of them do include some sort of like behavior change goals and focus in order to improve the quality of relationships during pregnancy in particular. So Glow Nurture encourages both the man and the woman to, well, in a, let's say, heterosexual relationship, in a way to track information, and the male partner will be sent prompts about what they ought to do for their partner during particularly difficult points in a pregnancy. And then finally, the last category of apps and services are just surveillance devices and services. Lovebite is maybe a somewhat innocent example of this, which includes, it's basically like a social media platform for a couple, but includes a tracking element where you can see physically where your partner is at all times. Once they have the app switched on, so you know where within a city or within a country they are. There are far more sinister versions of this. I didn't bother putting up a slide of this service. There's a service called FlexiSpy, which you can find easily enough online, which basically just gives you like NSA equivalent spying facilities on your partner, so you can covertly download it onto your partner's phone or tablet, and you can remotely listen in to what they're doing using the microphone or switch on the video without them knowing that it's happening, and track their locations at all times. It's very common for this to be found on the phones of people who use the services of domestic refuges for women with abusive partners in particular. So there are far more sinister forms of intimate surveillance as well. Okay, so those are the services and devices that are available, and then the three-part definition. What are the concerns that people have about this technology, about this practice of relationship quantification? So we found about 8 primary objections to the practice in the literature so far. And I just want to go through them and express the concerns that people have about the technology. So the first objection is something I'm going to call the inefficiency objection. The basic idea here is that some of these apps might select appropriate goals for a relationship. I mean, they might not as well, you might dispute the goals that they set, but for the purposes of argument, assume that they set good goals, but they're just not very effective tools for achieving those goals. People don't use them very often. The fact that a lot of these devices and services fail might be an indication of that as well. This kind of links into what Jane was talking about earlier on, that there's not really an effective science of behavior change underlying a lot of these services, so people don't really improve the quality of their relationships based on using these devices and apps. So that's one line of objection. Probably a more common line of objection, which I'm just going to call the measurement management objection, based on that old adage of what gets measured gets managed, is that the apps are quite effective tools that get people to focus on particular kinds of things and to change their behavior in particular ways, but those aren't positive or good ways to change your behavior because they have the wrong kinds of goals for relationships. So, or for sex life, let's say, so a sex tracking app that focuses on like the number of thrusts during a sexual encounter. Maybe you will fixate on that goal and you will improve the number of thrusts during a sexual encounter, but that's not necessarily indicative of good quality sex. So just an example of this from the writings of, I think it's Deborah Lupton. In the context of these sex tracking apps, sexual activity becomes reduced to the numbers, how long intercourse lasts, how often it takes place, how many thrusts are involved, the volume of sound emitted, how good it is and with how many partners. And these are just not useful goals to have set in your intimate life. So that's quite a common line of objection that you find in the literature. Another objection, and these are ones I'm actually more interested in, the next two, is something I'm going to call the informal reciprocation objection. This is the idea that appropriate intimate relationships are founded on some kind of model of informal reciprocation. So you do things for your intimate partners, you always have one another's back, you perform services and tasks for one another, but there's nobody keeping track of exactly what's being done for whom and when. There's no assumption or obligation of paying back in kind exactly what your partner has done for you. So there's this model of informal reciprocation. You will always do things for one another, but you won't keep track of it and adopt a formal exchange-based relationship model. So an example of somebody who's pushed that line of objection would be Karen Levy in her paper Intimate Surveillance. And she's actually quoting an argument developed by a journalist. So she says, gamification within relationships, so if you take an app like Couply and the kind of badges and leaderboards that it creates, that may foster a tit-for-tat exchange mentality within a relationship that is ultimately detrimental to the foundations of intimate relations and ultimately divests romantic gestures of their meaning. So the reason why I find that to be an interesting line of objection is that it takes a very particular view on what a good relationship is. It has a particular model of what a good relationship is in mind and uses that then to critique these services. A fourth objection that you find, something I'm going to call the Mutual Trust Objection, also similar in that it takes a particular view on the principles or values or virtues underlying a good relationship. The idea here is that good relationships are founded on mutual trust. You don't constantly check up on your partner, see what they're doing and what they're doing for you. You trust that they have your values and interests in mind. Now, you could talk about this in relation to fidelity, sexual fidelity, romantic fidelity. That might be one aspect of mutual trust, but I don't think it's the only way of understanding this mutual trust objection, just because not all good relationships are necessarily monogamous or sexually exclusive. That's an assumption that I work with in this paper anyway. So mutual trust is something much broader about operating and acting with your partner's values and interests in mind and in a way that's consistent with them without the need to check up on them. So Karen Levy again gives voice to this objection in her paper on intimate surveillance. She says, if partners remain faithful because they're afraid of being tattled on by digital technology rather than out of a sense of loyalty to their partner, does fidelity retain its long-standing social and emotional significance? That's a fourth objection. A fifth objection then. This is something we call the instrumental versus intrinsic value problem. And the idea here is that all these apps and services instrumentalize relationships. This is probably one of the more philosophical objections, and it actually arises from work that Sven and Brian have done in relation to the enhancement of relationships using biochemical technologies. And one concern that arises in that literature is that the use of these enhancement technologies often involves this kind of medicalizing ethos, that the reason you do it is because it benefits your health and well-being, not because the relationship itself is something that's intrinsically valuable, that has some worth independent of its broader consequences for your health and well-being. So if you look at a lot of these apps and services, they do tend to medicalize sexual and romantic behaviors. So you see that clearly in the case of like these sex tracking apps that track the number of calories burned, for example. So it has that kind of health and fitness focus rather than focusing on the intrinsic merits of a sexual encounter. To give an example of this, Deborah Lupton in her paper Quantified Sex has the following to say about this facet of apps. The association of sex with burning calories suggests the concept of sexual activity as a physical exercise. It's like running or swimming, something to be engaged in as part of fitness or weight control pursuits, and not as an end in itself. Sven Nyholm, one of the co-authors in this paper, refers to this problem as somebody committing an evaluative category mistake. They're just applying the wrong kinds of values to an activity. A sixth objection then that comes up quite a bit, something we call the gendered relationship objection. The idea here is that these apps and services tend to perpetuate or reinforce gender stereotypes within relationships. So two examples of this, again, one from the work of Deborah Lupton. The gender stereotypes are reinforced by, she's referring to sex tracking apps here in particular, by the focus on male performance. Men must achieve that should be aims, not arms, achieve the aims set by the algorithms of these devices as desirable evidence of superior sexual prowess. So to be like a top performer on Nipple, let's say, you have to demonstrate you've had sex with X number of people and in lots of different positions and different times and so forth. So it's that focus on being like a Don Juan. That's the language she uses in her paper. Another example of this then from Karen Levy, her paper Intimate Surveillance. This is a small snippet from a much longer quote, but she comments on it, how striking it is that many of these technologies construct women in particular as monitored subjects, people to be surveilled and monitored at all times. And she's particularly concerned about fertility tracking apps. I didn't mention this in the initial run-through of examples, but Glow and Glow Nurture are fertility tracking apps that are aimed and marketed primarily at women, but there are quite a number of fertility tracking apps that have been marketed at men as a way for them to know when their partner is likely to be unpleasant or in a bad mood. A lot of these have been very quickly wiped or removed from the App Store, but they do crop up over and over again. In fact, 2 were launched in 2016, only to be removed by Apple from the App Store after a couple of weeks, and a number of critical articles were written about them. So this is the idea then that these apps reinforce traditional kind of gender stereotypes within relationships and perpetuate certain imbalances of power within relationships. That's the sixth objection. Seventh objection, which I'll just refer to as the neoliberalisation objection, is the idea that these apps and services perpetuate or reinforce a neoliberal ideology. Now, what does that mean? Can mean different things in different contexts, but really what it seems to be doing here is it's individualizing and responsibilizing control over how productive or happy your relationship is. So it's your responsibility. You use this device, track information, and your relationship will improve. It's not the responsibility of a broader society to ensure that you have a good relationship. And you could argue plausibly that you do need social supports and social networks to have good quality, functioning, intimate relationships. So just to give you an illustration of this, again from Deborah Lupton's paper, this quote: "The practices of wellness and self-quantification these technologies champion compel," I wrote these out very quickly, that's the problem, compel with an increasing focus on, in neoliberal politics, comply with an increasing focus on neoliberal politics on emphasizing the personal behavior and self-responsibility of citizens. And then finally, an objection, which is kind of lurking in the background here. This is the elephant in the room, which is the privacy objection. Okay. Which is that these apps and services violate privacy rights. Okay. They collect information or data about couples, including intimate data, which people have a right to keep private. I mean, there are two directions from which you can think about the privacy objection. So it could be that your partner is violating your privacy rights by spying on you. That's one aspect of this. Or it could be that these apps and services are spying on you and collecting information about you against your will and in violation of your privacy rights. Now, within the paper, we make a move where we try to ignore that broader privacy debate about apps and the way in which apps and services collect information, because there's a lot written about that. We want to focus purely on ones that have something to do with relationships. We focus mainly on the ways in which your partner spies on you, or could be spying on you. But I'm sure people won't like the fact that we did that. Okay, so the final part here, why might you be in favor of this? And is there any space for cautious optimism? So we tried to argue that in a lot of these 8 objections, they raise legitimate concerns and fears that you could have about this technology, but that there is potentially some space for the positive use of this technology as well. And we have responses to each of the 8 objections, but I'm not going to go through in too much detail. What I'll do is I'll give you a general sense of our strategy within the paper, and then an example from one of the responses to one of the objections. All right, so we adopt like 3 main propositions or claims about relationships in the paper that influence how we interpret and understand each of the 8 objections outlined. Our first proposition or claim is that there is no single normatively persuasive model for a good relationship. In particular, the idea that a good relationship is one that involves like monogamous pair bonding based on mutually declared love. That is historically anachronistic and culturally anachronistic, and it's not the only way in which people can have positive and well-functioning relationships. That's one initial proposition we endorse. Second thing that we endorse is that it's not the case that anything goes within relationships, and I guess we're operating broadly within a kind of traditional liberal paradigm, although with some nods towards feminist theory, is that agency, autonomy, and consent are important properties or qualities of a good relationship, and that a good relationship is founded on respect for the agency and autonomy of the partners. So as long as you're respecting those values and consistent with those values, you can have many different models of what a good relationship is. And then finally, a third assumption that we have within the paper is that the relationship status quo, the current situation with regard to intimate relationships, for a lot of people is non-ideal. Relationships, as anyone will know, are rife with petty jealousies and mutual disrespect, inequalities of bargaining power, gendered assumptions, and so forth. So whenever you're assessing the merits of technology, and this is something I'm quite big on in other parts of my work, is that you must always bear in mind how it changes things relative to the status quo. You mustn't ignore that reality and how that might be negative. So you should avoid status quo bias in applied ethical reasoning. That's the rationale behind this. And then how this feeds into particular responses to the objections. So I'll just give the example of the informal reciprocation objections. That was the idea that a good relationship is founded on informal reciprocation, not a formal exchange model. People aren't keeping track of exactly who owes what to whom at any moment in time. one of the claims we advance in the paper is that actually informal reciprocation can be quite problematic. It can favor the dominant partner within a relationship, oftentimes the male, that they are the beneficiaries of this informal reciprocation model, and that introducing some degree of tracking and accountability within a relationship can actually be more positive than you might think. So just to delve into this in more detail, we think the informal reciprocation objection has both expressive and psychological dimensions. So the idea is that if you adopt a formal exchange model, it changes the meaning of the gestures that you perform within the relationship. It expresses somehow disrespect or a coldness or distance towards your partner. And this will also change how we think and interact with our partners. And in response to that concern, we think that actually the expressive meanings of behaviours within relationships is highly variable and highly contingent. Couples can adopt their own kind of private languages and private meanings associated with gestures. So we can't adopt this kind of totalizing perspective on them. Informal reciprocation, again, often benefits the more powerful partner within a relationship, and tracking can ensure greater accountability and equity. And that this isn't just true in theory or nice sounding idea, that some couples actually seem to make this work in practice. Predominantly couples who have some sort of investment in the quantified self industry. So one notorious example of this is Bethany Soul and Daniel Reeves. They're makers of an app called BeMinder, which is a behavior change app. And they were featured in this article in NBC News a few years ago called "The Couple That Pays Each Other to Put the Kids to Bed," where they adopt an explicitly formal exchange-based model within their relationship where they actually monetize the performance of certain tasks. So whenever you want to do something or that is unpleasant, they each submit bids for how much they would have to be paid to perform that task. And the person who, I think it's the person who submits the lowest bid has to perform the task, and the other person has to pay them, I think it's a little bit more than what they actually bid to do the task. Okay? And they've written about this extensively, that this has introduced greater equity and fairness within their relationship. There's less kind of seething resentment towards the other partner for not pulling their weight or doing their fair share. So we think this is an illustration of how, again, there's no perfect model of a relationship, and some couples kind of make these models work. So that's one example of an objection. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you'll have more to ask about afterwards. So yeah, I'll end it there. Thank you.